Welcome again, everyone, to another hopefully exciting episode of Disruption Drives, your go-to spot for all things future of mobility. My next guest is a true expert on all things disruption. John Moon is the managing director at Mochanix. And Mochanix, incidentally, is a portmanteau of mobile and mechanics and fleet mechanics. And he's going to talk about both those highly disruptive industries today. But he's had clients focused on the auto manufacturing industry with a recent stint at Honda Innovations. But his background is fairly vast and deep across several areas of disruption. He actually also sits as an ambassador to Covesa, an automotive consortium, the leading consortium of connected vehicles in the world. And his background has included some very interesting stints across mobile phone telecommunications, a video game, interactive advertising, and credit card security. His sheer mosaic of expertise across several disruptive trends makes him a perfect guest for our show. So, John, thank you for coming on. And I wanted to start with a sort of a philosophical question on, I know that you probably have thought deeper than most people. A lot of OEMs, and we call original equipment manufacturers and fleet companies broadly, they they keep saying, and that they want to turn into mobility companies. So from a manufacturing base to mobility, what does that mean?
Well, and thanks for having me on, Harry. And yes, so in looking at that question, I think what it really means is to want to serve customers directly, right? Being able to really actually engage with customers. And I think fleet companies likely do this more than OEMs do. Um, but you need to have that direct interaction with customers because I think you need to be able to evolve your product and think about your product and see actually the change that happens. And so to truly be a mobility company, I think you need to really work directly with customers. And that's really the essence of being able to um, understand what it's needed to provide that service and have the appropriate digital capabilities to do that.
And so what does it typically mean though, working directly with customers? Traditional, let's say a Ford or General Motors or Toyota, for example, they worked, of course, they made the cars. They then worked through a channels of dealerships, which then sold the cars. And then, of course, you have fleet companies that, of course, operate the cars, including, my former employer, Avis Car Rental, which, of course, work directly with consumers. But what does a mobility company mean that is different from make an automaker, a historical automaker that, of course, came up in the 20th century.
Yeah, I think it's to really operate that service that a consumer ends up using. And I think in a lot of cases you're able to provide and service the needs of the customer directly. I mean, currently, if you're a OEM, a lot of that actually moves out to the dealership in terms of being able to service the car or other service providers that provide the the needs of the customer, whether it's for parking or fuel or even for charging. Those are actually provided by other entities to a varying degree, some completely, some in the case of OEMs are beginning to stand up those types of services kind of more directly. I think EV has really been the forcing function or the leveraging of the ability to provide services as EV charging. Potentially, some of those things have begun coming in-house to OEMs. So you're really starting to see the maybe the fruits of early efforts to become mobility companies actually starting to take hold.
And what was this history? I think you mentioned when we were just talking outside that, the history started with really Ford, which of course actually was one of the early pioneers of the auto totally. But and looks like so Ford started this, in your mind at least, started this trend. Tell us more about that. How did this trend start?
Yeah, I mean they really put a stake in the ground. I think they were the first or one of the first and actually I think a number of OEMs kind of decided to try to call themselves mobility companies in which they are actually providing the services that are related to the vehicle and or provide additional other services that are related to transporting people from one place to another. They had acquired Spin, they acquired Chariot to um, get into the fleet business. They invested in Argo. They invested in other technology companies to really try to move in that direction. I don't think it quite made. I don't think they quite had all the pieces kind of organized to make that work. And I think, in 2021, they tried to evolve things to partner with kind of the hyperscalers with like Google Cloud and other things. I think they've realized it's not just by buying the components that you can create a mobility company. Um, and really, it's 2025. I think maybe you're starting to see the fruits of those efforts really kind of form into more consistent services that I think have started to actually become the digital service that you would expect in this day and age.
Absolutely. And so you really, what the OEMs and fleet companies are doing is owning, creating almost a closed loop of owning the customer experience, starting from purchase, but really to the entire life cycle of the car itself. But you brought up an interesting point on, look, you said that 2025 is when these companies are starting to see some results of that. We're also very clearly at an inflection point on the, promising technology at this stage, still nascent, of autonomy. How do you think autonomy changes that or facilitates that or disrupts or prevents that?
Well, I think, very similar to electrification, how that kind of pushes things. I think with autonomy, there's the opportunity potentially to serve customers a direct again. And so regardless of what that model might look like, now you're building products that need to fit within a particular ecosystem that is maybe different than what you normally provide, which was one vehicle for one driver, one family, or providing a vehicle to a driver. And so there are a number of different options, and I think you're starting to see that the efforts that have come before have basically informed or allowed for the business to potentially become that. So you're starting to see even transformations, the bets that have been made have kind of turned over once,
Yeah.
and you're starting to see now players that you didn't necessarily anticipate being part of the story are maybe still part of the story. You look at a company like Zoox, and I mean, if you remember, even just 4 or 5 years ago, Cruise was the quote unquote winner out the gate, serving customers. Now we're here 4 or 5 years. Potentially Tesla's also now launched their service. You have Neuro, Lucid, and Uber, which I don't know if anyone had that on their bingo card. now now moving into that space as well.
It
And
was like
as
the DoorDash there and their bots and the delivery bots, which is
Exactly, and that as one company leaves the space, another enters the space in a whole new different way. So um, that transformation, requires kind of this uh, synergy between hardware and software, and I think we're starting to see that, and we're starting to see that, and it's been basically 10 years kind of in the making.
so you just you talked about Tesla, you mentioned Zoox, and I'm assuming Waymo as well. You would imply look, it's Google's self-driving car project. And you mentioned, the Neuro, Lucid ecosystem, Uber, DoorDash. But one of them, you did not mention any of the traditional fleet companies, with the exception of GM Cruise, which now, of course, has been applied to as gone defunct. But let me ask you a sort of a contrasting question on the nature of a manufacturing business and, of course, these software defined asset light companies that, of course, just happen to make cars. Just to sort of drill down a little bit, manufacturing companies are inherently built on massive economies of scale, large capital investments that, you need to build an assembly line and a factory built to make a car. Now, software happens to be the exact opposite, right? You build software quickly, put it out on the market, change it. Is there, but then a car, a robo taxi or any type of fleet at the end of the day is a huge chunk of metal. So, is there any inherent advantage at all that a manufacturing company has in the world of mobility?
I mean, it's a vital part, obviously, that exists, but I do think it tends to, if you have those two organizations, if you have the same leadership of those two organizations working together, that puts, I, I tend to think that that puts a manufacturing organization at a disadvantage. And I've seen this a number of times where it's been a disadvantage because um, when you're building a piece of hardware in the time scales that you're looking at for economies of scale and large capital investments, you do spend a lot of time thinking about it and a lot of time planning in order to make sure that there are no mistakes. And as you said, where software allows you to adjust and allows you to adjust to how the market or how consumers might be changing or shifting. Um, and so to marry those two pieces together to make that work together does require kind of confidence and also and trust in what the other, what the right brain or the left brain might be doing in terms of trying to build that business. And I think being aligned with what the goal is for that needs to be done again with a lot of trust to accomplish that goal. And if those goals are misaligned, then yes, I think there can be significant divergence in terms of what that goal might be and how you get there.
And it looks like what you're saying, look, the nature of software lends itself to, more iterative ways of learning versus the hard goods. You need to get things right, off the gate. And the
Yeah,
traditional
and I
model
think
of
you I think you see where that conclusion may have materialized, where you have these 10,000 person software engineering organizations, which is if you start analyzing the problem from a hardware lens, or applying a hardware lens to how do you actually build software, then the result is 10,000 person engineering organizations. Whereas, and we see what happens when that happens. That has not been successful, and we've seen the unfolding of those very large software organizations that have done that.
You have seen this before in the smartphone industry, right? Where, look, the phone at the end of the day is a physical product. Now, of course, we think of it as largely software across the ecosystem, right? So can we draw some parallels here? How do you think uh, the traditional car companies, I mean, do they learn, but also avoid the pitfalls of the traditional, phone makers? Let's say Nokia, Sony Ericsson, I think was another example back in the day. No one I see now carries a Motorola or a Sony Ericsson or even a Nokia. These are very rare. Uh, how is this industry? What should the automaker industry take away from this? This basically this what happened 15 years ago.
Yeah, and the way I kind of see it or look or view it is that really they ignored the application. It says it's said that they ignored the App Store, but really to me, I think they've ignored digital experiences. And mostly Nokia as Sony was an Android OEM, but I think what they suffered is the fate of what Android manufacturers are suffering now, and which traditional OEMs are kind of falling within that same story is they're competing against each other and not really focused on the digital experience or how that could improve. They're focused on now kind of implementing the same software stack so that they believe that they can do the same things that everyone else needs to be able to do, rather than really focus on the digital experience. Um, if you look at existing or the challenger OEMs, the new OEMs that actually can focus on building those digital experiences, they don't have, you know, hundreds of different cars and car models. They have consolidated or basically have one operating system that they work on across their entire model sets, someone like Tesla or someone like Rivian. Um, it's a luxury they have because they actually have a small number of vehicles that they actually produce and create. But if they stick to it, then it's very much more like Apple than it is like Android, in which you have a very vast and wide ecosystem of potential software and applications that you can produce, and it gives you all of the optionality that you could create. But is that really what you want to do? Is that really creating a digital experience that
And the
that
point we bring up is,
delivers?
look, a phone at the end of the day is a digital experience, even before the smartphone. At the end of the day, you exchanged voice, but electric signals of that voice to talk to someone else. Versus a car, you need to actually be on the road and at some level go from a physical movement is there. And we keep talking about digital experiences at the same, but at the same time, what's I assume what's going to move the needle is the actual real world experience of it being a comfortable ride. So that cannot be made into an app, I assume.
Yes, yes, and that's where maybe the story breaks down a bit. But in the Nokia and Sony story, we saw the consolidation. There used to be a dozen or so different OEM manufacturers: LG, HTC,
Yeah.
Sony, Nokia, Microsoft. We forget Microsoft used to
Yes,
make
very much.
Microsoft Windows
They
Mobile.
were barely a blip in the mobile phone world, but yes, they were a very significant
Yes, but now it's consolidated down. And so if we follow that story, then potentially there is a consolidation of OEMs within the market, because it is an interesting industry to me, in that it's a very almost uniform kind of in terms of its distribution, meaning no one owns like half the market or quarter of the market. It's really fairly uniform, large segments. Um, and
but
so
highly capital intensive as well. And there's
yes,
tens of billions at a minimum that have been spent by any respectable player in the space.
right. And so it's interesting to see as the platforms kind of become more uniform. How is that competition going to work? And then as you're starting to compete with new challengers able to deliver digital services in a more expedited way, and in a way that is to be or anticipated, or how a consumer expects it to be. um, what's going to be what's going to be the outcome? That might be different in this scenario, because again, as you said, very capital intensive to build a vehicle, and there might be other consumers that are looking for other things other than just the digital experience.
Absolutely, John. Well, that's about what we have time for today. And as of last month, General Motors has announced that the Cadillac Escalade 2028 will be ideally an eyes-off, hands-off driving experience, probably a personally owned autonomous vehicle. Now, this has happened before. GM is definitely following the trends that you just talked about, which is they're trying to create what they're calling an integrated software platform. They're not going to allow Apple CarPlay. They're going to possibly create their own navigation systems and possibly their own entertainment systems within the car and make it a software experience as it is. But to your point, I think let's maybe the last point you made was what is going to be the outcome? Well, no one really knows at this point. And so, on that note, I do want to end the show. And I hope all of you had fun listening to this as much as I did. John, thank you so much for coming again. And we hope to have you again to talk about many more deep topics.
Great. Thanks, Harry.